The Gallipoli Campaign. When was the Gallipoli Campaign? On the 25th of April, 1915, the Allied Mediterranean Expeditionary Force lands on the Gallipoli Peninsula in current-day Turkey. On the 28th of that same April, the First Battle of Krithia commences, and it is a major loss for the Allies. They land, and they have to fight uphill the entire time, and it does not go very well for them. On the 1st of May, the Allies are attacked at night. They survive, but they did face heavy casualties. On the 6th, 7th, and 8th of May, the Second Battle of Krithia happens, and it is another devastating defeat for the Allies. On the 19th of May, the Turkish counterattack is defended, but there are 10,000 casualties for the Allied forces, and it does push them back slightly, so they lost any ground of the little that they gained. On the 24th of May, an armistice is enacted so that the troops can go and gather the dead bodies and bury them. On the 4th of June, the Third Battle of Krithia. It's a heavy loss from both sides, but the Allies do end up losing that battle also. On the 21st of June, the French take Helles, but with many casualties. This is a hill that they were trying to take for many weeks since the start of the battle. And on the 28th of June, the Battle of Gully Ravine occurs. It is an initial success for the Allies, but for the lack of artillery, it causes them to eventually fail. On the 2nd of July, Turkish forces unsuccessfully tried to reclaim Helles, which the French took a couple weeks before. On that same 5th of July, another attack successfully defended with 16,000 Turkish casualties. The Allies do lose about 10,000 troops in that too, give or take. On August 6th, 7th, and 8th, a major battle for control of key positions occurs between the Allies and the Central Powers. On the 10th of August, troops are driven off of those recently captured key points because they had to move the troops out that had captured them and brought new troops in, and they were new, not experienced, and did not know the terrain. On the 15th of August, the British attack on Silva fails. They face heavy casualties, and it's just another failure for the Allies. On the 21st of August, final major attack on the key positions fails. This is seen as defeat is imminent. They are pretty much giving up at this point. On September to December, the British and Allied governments talk and debate on evacuating the troops and a plan to get them out of there without facing heavy casualties. On the 7th of December, the British evacuation is ordered, and within a month or so, the entire army has been evacuated from the peninsula. These are just some pictures that shows how the Allied forces were constantly fighting an uphill battle over the hills here. They are constantly trying to gain those positions of altitude so they can get the high ground over the straits and over the forts that the Central Powers had occupied. This is just a timeline for World War I in general, just a basic timeline. On the 28th of June, 1914, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary is assassinated, and that leads to, on July 28th, World War I starting when Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia after a Serbian killed the Archduke Ferdinand. In August, Germany declares war on Russia, France, and Belgium. Austria declares war on Russia. Montenegro declares war on Austria. France declares war on Austria also, and England as well. And then Montenegro declares war on Germany eventually. In that same August, Japan declares war on Germany, and Austria declares war on Belgium. On September 6th, the First Battle of Marne begins. On November 5th, Britain and France declare war on the Ottoman Empire, which is who they fight in the Battle of Gallipoli on the peninsula. On April 22nd, the First Battle of Ypres begins, and Germany uses chemical warfare for the first time, which was seen as barbaric and that no country would like to take part in that because it would destroy their figure and relationships with other countries. On April 25th, troops land in the Gallipoli Peninsula. The French land there, the English land there, and also the Anzac, which would be the Australians and the New Zealand forces. On May 7th, the Lusitania is sunk by the Germans, which is a passenger ship that was sunk by a German submarine and killed 120 something Americans, which started the conflict between the Americans and the Germans and would, along with the Zimmermann Note, eventually lead the Americans to join the war efforts. On February 21st, 1916, the Battle of Verdun begins, which is one of the most major battles of World War I, and it lasts 10 months with many, many casualties. On July 1st, the First Battle of Somme begins. On April 6th of 1917, the United States ends up declaring war on Germany and joining the Allied forces because of the sinking of the Lusitania by the Germans, and also the Zimmermann Note, which tried to pin Mexico against the United States. On the 20th of November of the same year, the British offensive in Cambrai goes on. On March 3rd, the Soviets surrender Ukraine and accept the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. On November 11, 1918, an armistice is signed signaling peace between the Allies and Germany, which is led by Woodrow Wilson and his 14-point plan, which also starts the League of Nations. On that same day, all air, ground, and sea fighting is ceased, and this signals the official end of World War I, also known as the Great War. Some historical context of what went on during the period in 1915. On the 25th of January 1915, Alexander Graham Bell talks from New York to San Francisco over telephone, which is the first transcontinental telephone call that occurs. On May 1st, the Lusitania departs and is sunk shortly after by a German torpedo. On the 23rd of May, Italy officially joins the war. On the 24th of July, the SS Eastland sinks in the Chicago River while docked, killing 844 people, and to this day this is still the deadliest crash in the Great Lakes area. On the 5th of October, Bulgaria ends up joining the war, and on the 25th of November, Albert Einstein presents the basis of general relativity. Where did the Gallipoli Campaign happen? This is the Gallipoli Peninsula on the left image, which is off the coast of Turkey. There was 4 separate landings on this peninsula, one by the Anzac, which would be again the Australians and the New Zealand forces, the 29th Division, which is slightly more south, which would be the English troops, and the Irish also, and the French would land at Comcale, and a smaller French fleet would land at Basica Bay. The smaller fleet was not intended to get very far, it was intended to distract the Ottoman Empire and also to create an element of surprise for where the main campaign would be occurring. On the left it shows where the first battle of Krithia happened and how they were constantly fighting an uphill battle trying to get up into the hills on the peninsula of Gallipoli. The initial plan for the war was to take the coast here and the high points on the coast with the several plateaus above the strait in the middle, and then they would take the naval force all the way down the strait, all the way down to Constantinople, which is also called Istanbul, and that would cut off the supply line to Russia, officially taking Turkey out of the war in the Ottoman Empire. These maps show how the terrain of the peninsula really affected how the Allies would fight the war and eventually affected the outcome of the war. On the left, it shows that the contours, how the farther you get in, the higher elevation you have. So it was just constantly fighting an uphill battle towards those troops. It shows that there was one lake on the left, which was right past Sulva Bay, which made the Anzac troops have to detour around the side of that. And on the right, this shows how the plan of the troops would come in from the coast, come in and take the high points in the forts over the straits, so they could eventually get their naval forces to come down through the river. Which, in the first place, the entire goal was to not have any troops on the land in the first place. It would be to fight the battle strictly from the sea. They were going to try and use their navy to take out all the fortifications along the coast in the straits, and eventually take their ships all the way down through Turkey. The map on the left gives a better visual representation of the uphill battle that I keep referring to, but it is important because it is one of the biggest reasons why the Allied forces do end up losing this battle and having to retreat. So you see all the hills and mountains and plateaus, which would be where the forts are, that the Allied forces were trying to take over through the entirety of the campaign. And on the left, it shows the initial plan and goal of the battle, which was to send the Allied ships through the Dardanelles, up the Narrows, and take out all the forts and fortifications on the coast, which were trying to stop, obviously, the naval forces from reaching Istanbul, which would be the capital of the Ottoman Empire. And once they reached Istanbul, it would threaten Istanbul and basically take Turkey out of the war, because they'd have to take their forces out to defend their capital to stop their country from being taken over by the Allied forces. Who fought in this battle? On the Allied side, it would be Australia and New Zealand, which forced the Anzac forces, and France and the England forces, which are also known as the 29th Division, which included Irish soldiers also. On the Central Powers, it would be Germany and Turkey, also known as the Ottoman Empire. Austria-Hungary did not fight in this battle because they were preoccupied with other battles. The main conflict is between Australia and New Zealand and Germany and Turkey, also known as the Ottoman Empire. France and England had land efforts, but they were relatively small because they had majority of the naval campaign and the boats that were trying to go through the straits, which the troops are trying to clear their path and sweep for landmines and such. Mainly naval conflict in this battle, which was their attempt in the first place, was to do strictly naval conflict, but that ended up not working out. And the US would not join the war efforts until 1917, which was after the campaign had ended. The US would end up joining the war after Germany sinks a ship and kills over 120 Americans in that. Austria-Hungary also did not take part in this battle. What was the Gallipoli Campaign? The campaign is initially seen as a gamble by the Allied forces and their governments of England, France, Australia, and New Zealand. It was intended to completely knock Turkey or the Ottoman Empire out of the war by cutting off their supply line to Russia. The plan was to take out land-based strongholds by sea only. They attempted to use their strict naval force to push through the fortifications and all the way to Constantinople. But they ended up never getting close because they could not advance their ships through the straits because of the strongholds, which ended up sending the troops in there to clear the path, but ended up going for a year or so with the Allies pushing against the Central Powers, but the Central Powers pushing back even harder, and the Allies really never made any progress whatsoever. It was a lot of trench warfare. They were constantly fighting uphill, as you can see in this picture. They are running out of the trenches up the hills where the forts from the Central Powers were, and if they took over those forts, they would have possession of the high ground over the straits, over those fortifications, and would really give them the advantage in this battle. This battle is initially a failure because of the lack of knowledge of terrain. The knowledge was available, but the preparation was not very good on the side of the Allies. They used very poorly made and researched maps that were old and did not know the fortifications, locations of the forts, elevations, and such. After March of 1915, naval attacks were stopped in fear of further loss. Through this campaign of them trying to push their navy through the small straits that were heavily fortified, they ended up losing a very, very large amount of men in this. The troops were deployed in late April, which is almost a month or a month and a half after the naval forces stopped attacking, which would give them time to refortify, fortify further, heal up, and bring more troops in, get more resources, ammo, weapons, explosives, and such. A month and a half is a very large amount of time for an army to prepare for an attack that they know where the attack is coming from also. The troops were inserted in 3 main locations and 1 location with a smaller amount of troops. The main locations were by the Anzac, the 29th Division, which was the British and the French, and the smaller location was another French force, which was meant to distract the main push from the other beaches and to create an element of surprise for the main attack and its location. The troops were sent to capture the Kilid Bar Plateau from the 4 locations. Their goals were to take from the coast on 4 separate points and eventually meet together, take out the main plateau, which had a fort on it, and to get the high ground over the straits and all of the fortifications, which would allow them to basically win the battle very, very easily. And the capture of this plateau would give high ground over the fort of Kilid Bar and the straits, and which would be able to take the weaponry from that fort, use it against them, take out their defenses on the straits, and take out their landmines, which would allow the Navy to push their fleet through the straits, and would allow the troops to advance with the Navy, taking out the defenses and giving them the path all the way to the capital of the Ottoman Empire, which would be Constantinople, and would allow them to take Turkey out of the war and make the war a whole lot easier for the Allied forces. Allied troops were sent to land at Cape Helles and Gabatepe, which included again the English, the French, the Australians, and the New Zealand forces. The Turkish commander discovered these locations and dug in with trenches and reinforced defenses. This occurred during the month and a half period between when the Navy stopped attacking and the troops ended up landing, which would be on April 25th. 2 smaller landings were planned at Bolaire and Beskia Bay to distract from the main landings. This would try and give the main landings the element of surprise through not being sure which attack was the main attack, which would be the blunt of the troops. The British landed at Cape Helles. the Australian and New Zealand, also known as the Anzac troops, landed north of Gallipoli. They drifted very, very far north, landed much off course, which ended up landing them in a cove, which was later named the Anzac Cove because of how many troops ended up dying there. They could not push out of that cove just because of the fact that there was high ground on both sides of the exit to that cove, which the Ottoman Empire took advantage of and stopped the troops from being able to force their way through. The French landed at Combe with very little opposition, which allowed them to push further and attempt to meet up with the troops of the other countries. The British took the Turkish positions, but with great loss. They could really never take more than the initial positions that they were trying to take. The British were then sent to capture the summit of Akibaba. The summit was never captured through the whole campaign. Throughout the whole campaign, they attempted to take it, and then they get pushed back, and they push further, and then they get pushed back, and it was an endless cycle for the entirety of the campaign, which lasted about a year or so. The Anzac forces, or the Australian and New Zealand forces, were sent to take the summit of Sari Bair Ridge. Throughout the entirety of the campaign, they were in terrible strategic positions, and the lack of knowledge of the terrain caused hardship for those troops. Because of their deployment spot where they landed, it was very, very hard for them to push back to where they were supposed to land in the first place to take Sari Bair Ridge and end up meeting with the other Allied forces. New British troops were introduced into the battle, and they were sent to land at Suvla Bay as a last effort. This was seen as a last effort because after months of fighting and pushing on the Ottoman Empire, the Allied forces really never made any progress to progress inland and take out those defenses to allow the Navy to further progress down into Constantinople, which would again allow them to take Turkey out of the war and cut off their supply line to Russia. After failure to capture many key points, victory was seen as impossible, and the plan for evacuation was started. It took about 2 months from September to December of 1915 for the government of England to work with the French, the Australian, and New Zealand to get that evacuation plan underway and moving, and they would eventually get evacuated in the very beginning of 1916. The outcome of the battle could be attributed to the strength of the Central Powers or the reluctancy of the Allies. The Allies were very reluctant to be aggressive throughout the entire campaign, which would have given them the opportunity to counterattack some of the Turkish attacks to push them back, which possibly could have allowed them to further progress inland and take on those forts, which would then allow them to sweep for mines and take out the fortifications on the straits, which would allow the Navy to push further inland, and eventually their goal was to go all the way to the capital of the Ottoman Empire of Constantinople. Those opportunities include counterattacks and separate attacks on strongholds, such as when the Ottoman forces in the night tried to attack the Allied forces, which was then defended by the Allied forces and caused about 10,000 casualties for the Ottomans. Then they were reluctant to push those forces further back inland to try and take out the fortifications with the lack of troops at those locations. That could have definitely changed the outcome 100% because they would have then taken those points, which would again allow them to get the high ground on the straits and the fortifications down in there. They underestimated the Ottoman forces, which was seen as weak after the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 13, which they lost very, very badly. Their military did not perform very well, and they ended up having an entire overhaul of their military, except for a couple troops, which was assumed that they were going to be very weak and ill-prepared and ill-advised because of the newness of the troops and the fact that they had just come off of this terrible loss. The underestimation caught the Allies off guard and could have definitely attributed to the outcome, because when you are not prepared, you are obviously not going to be able to fight a very good war, especially when you're fighting an uphill battle. The Allies did not take advantage of the available information and put the brunt of their forces into the strongholds that were being fortified by the Ottoman Empire. The main landing point, the Dardanelles, had been fortified since the time of the Trojan War. So for hundreds of years, the same place has been fought over because you can take complete control and advantage of the straits, which could be a supply line, or you could take it to cut off a supply line, which were the goal of the Allied forces in this battle. There had been major construction done to further fortify the defenses there in the recent past, and the Allied forces knew that it had been fortified, but underestimated their forces. They knew that there had been construction going on to plant more mines, build concrete defenses along the straits and their forts, but the Allies still overlooked this key fact and allowed the Ottomans to prepare, especially in that month and a half period between when the Navy stopped attacking and the troops actually landed in that April. This month and a half would again allow time for the troops to prepare, gather weapons, further fortify, plant more mines, heal and rest up. And the Allies also underestimated their preparedness for battle just because of their major military reconstruction from 1913 to 14. After their major loss in the Balkan War, they completely overhauled their military, new generals, new officers, etc. So the Allies did not expect them to be prepared for another battle just 2 years after this happened, and they were just not prepared all around. Throughout the entire campaign, the terrain struggles were very hard on the Allied forces, and the lack of knowledge of the terrain led to many hardships, especially by the Anzac forces, which faced much struggle from the terrain because they had landed in the cove and valley and spent much time, resources, and lives trying to get out of the valley. Because as you can see in the picture in the bottom right, they landed in the middle, which is labeled Anzac Beach, which is what it's called today because of the loss of life. They ended up having to push up that hill, the large hill with the forts on it, and fight an uphill battle to try and just reach their initial drop-in point, which was south down the coast. They had to push through there and try to reach up with the other forces, which were also trying to push through the defenses to meet up and take control of the key points. Capture this hill would have given the Allies a strategic high ground, but the battle was uphill and very challenging for the Allied forces to fight uphill, because when you're trying to climb uphill with a gun and shoot back at people while you're getting fired on from multiple locations, it's just not very good. There was a drastic lack of preparation on the Allies' side, which again caused them to struggle very much based on the terrain, because they put in their troops where the strongholds were from the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire had prior knowledge of where the troops were going to be pushed into the beaches, so they had time to fortify, lay mines, dig trenches, and lay barbed wire in said locations. There was knowledge of the terrain available but not taken advantage of. There was maps made and knowledge of these fortifications that were made prior in the past that the Allied forces never took advantage of because they were underestimating the Ottoman Empire's troops after their very bad loss in the Balkan War and their complete overhaul of their military. This could be attributed as a large part of the outcome of the campaign. Obviously, when you're not prepared and then put the brunt of your forces into the heavily fortified locations instead of attacking the weak points, it's going to be a very tough battle, especially when you're uphill and it's just the odds are not in your favor and it does not go very well. Were the Allied troops doomed from the start? From the beginning of the campaign, it was seen as a large gamble by the Allied forces of France, England, Australia, and New Zealand. There were many people in the governments of those countries that were against sending troops because they knew it was fortified, and they also were going to try and take it strictly from the sea, which they knew there was going to be mines. And the Allies planned to take the peninsula strictly from the water all the way down to Istanbul or Constantinople, which is the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and cut off the supply line to Russia. Through the campaign, there was 27,000 French casualties, 73,485 British and Irish casualties, 41,515 Anzac casualties, which again was the Australians and the New Zealand troops, and there was 250,000 Ottoman casualties. Even though the Ottomans had way more casualties than the Allied forces, they still were able to keep control of their forts and the high ground and the straits, which allowed their navy to never push in, and the troops eventually had to be evacuated. On the Australian home front, the Red Cross led a fundraising effort in Australia, selling posters and war bonds and such in the first 2 weeks of the campaign. This is the start of the Australian branch of the Red Cross. This Australian branch of the Red Cross was made to support troops and help wounded troops heal, and this effort led many women to volunteer during this time, so the women could support the troops in battle, especially the wounded ones, and some even went over and were nurses on the battlefield. This gave the women of Australia an opportunity to be part of the war effort, while still maintaining their womanly position and making sure the troops were healed and also helping the war effort. The Red Cross grew more and more during the war, and eventually they opened up multiple rehab facilities for injured soldiers, and the Australian Red Cross is still a big thing in Australia today, and they still help soldiers today with rehab also and with injuries on the field and helping them with the war efforts. Chemical warfare during the Gallipoli Campaign. During the campaign, the Ottomans transferred a very large amount of sulfur back to the Gallipoli Peninsula. This amount gave them the capability to dispatch large-scale chemical warfare on the Allied forces. British officers, of hearing news of this, started production of gas protection for soldiers, such as respirators and gas masks, such as you can see in the top right picture. Egypt was the country producing these PPEs for the soldiers, which the resources and money was produced by the British for the production of these PPEs. Churchill then formed multiple committees on chemical warfare and how and when and if it should be used in defense or offense against the Central Forces. The research and production of offensive chemical weapons was started. After this fear, the Allies would not be the first to deploy them. They insisted. The general of the British Army and Churchill were very against starting the attacks with the chemical weapons because chemical weapons were seen as barbaric and would damage England's public figure, which they very drastically wanted to avoid. The only chemical weapons in England's arsenal were tear gas grenades. These were weak in comparison to the weapons that the Ottomans were thought to have. International morals were the main consideration in why this arsenal should be grown or not. The general was very reluctant to use the chemical weapons because, again, it would hurt Britain's public figure, which they very wanted to avoid because that's their main goal, is to maintain their prestige and public figure to be a world power. The general cited the wind and the possibility of retaliation with worse chemicals as reasons why not to deploy chemical weapons because it could then backfire on his troops and cause more casualties and cost more damage than they would have gotten regardless. Britain wanted to keep the prestige in public figure because chemical weapons were seen as barbaric, and they wanted to maintain this public figure so they can be a world power and have influence. A German officer was reported carrying 20 metal tubes of some type of chemical, which looked like it included sulfur, back to the German front, which could then be transferred to the Ottoman Empire. This was seen as a possible asphyxiating gas, such as tear gas or mustard gas, and this helped bring tensions to an all-time high because this proved that the Germans had the chemical weapons and were willing to use them. Fears were so high that chemical warfare was labeled as a mortal threat to the entire campaign, and this was in the back of the minds of everybody fighting there. Once the failure of the campaign was seen as probable, talks were started about the use of chemical warfare on the offensive side to try and salvage this battle that they were badly losing. The Ottomans were already equipped with respirators, so this was contemplated further. The Allies knew that they had respirators because of the Armistice Day. They used the respirators while they went out and collected and buried the dead bodies of the troops. News came into officers that the Ottomans had refused chemical weapons from the Germans because they were also afraid of retaliation with chemical weapons and it escalating from there. This news led to the de-escalation of fears and the refusal of even sending defensive chemicals to retaliate.